Welcome to Talk South Asian to Me Season 2. My name is Mashal.
And my name is Anusha. Tune in every Thursday at 5 p.m. Central and hear us react to each other's stories about mental health and growing up in different South Asian households.
And remember, this podcast is not therapy. Engage with what feels entertaining and resonates with you and leave what does. Okay, you ready for
Topic reveal.
Yes.
Drum roll.
Drum roll. For today is open communication.
Yes. Love it.
Mm-hmm.
I love all things communication.
Right? It's just such a basic concept, but also can be so complex at the same time, I feel like.
Yeah. We could literally sit here and talk for hours, days even.
Yeah. And I know we talked about how we've touched on communication in different episodes before, but I'm really excited to kind of really dive deep into the concept of communication patterns, how it shows up in our culture. So I'm really excited.
I'm all ready.
Okay, so I know open communication. I wanted to first kind of focus on communication only, and then we'll go into open communication. So I'm going to define communication, talk about communication patterns, and then we'll go into what it means when we add open in front of it. So according to the American Psychological Association, APA, the definition of communication is, quote, the transmission of information which may be verbal, oral or written, or nonverbal. Humans communicate to relate and exchange ideas, knowledge, feelings, and experiences, and for many other interpersonal and social purposes. So that's just a very basic definition of communication. Transmission of information could be verbal or nonverbal. So, according to a Psychology Today article by Dan Major or Mager, I don't know if I'm pronouncing the last name correctly. This article is titled "The Four Primary Principles of Communication." It was published in February of 2017. So, the author of this article kind of talks about the basic principles of communication and what those are. So, the first one is the message sent is not necessarily the message received. Okay, so the message sent may not be the message received because it must pass through a filtering system of thoughts and feelings for both the sender and the receiver. So if one person sends a message, right, communicates verbally or non-verbally, it goes to the other person, but the other person might not understand it the same way, just because there's different thoughts and feelings that come into play for the receiver.
Our perceptions.
Right.
Yeah.
They kind of make things more beautiful and complicate things, right? Yes. To further define this first principle, the author says in this article, quote, there is considerable room for misunderstanding between what the speaker intends to say and then what they actually say and what the listener hears. So there's that discrepancy between the two. And then the last part of this first principle that I wanted to talk about was that checking out the accuracy of your communication involves literally asking what the other person heard you say. So it's literally what a teacher does, right? Like you ask for teach back. Like, I am going to the restroom. Where am I going? And then the person has to say, yeah, you're going to the restroom, just to make sure that they understand the communication, the information that you communicated.
Or like in a nuanced way, like what I tell clients is, sometimes if what you tell your partner, maybe for example, why didn't you do dishes? It's a question. Depending on the tone, it might just be a curiosity. But how it's received by the person might be, you didn't do the dishes, I asked you to do dishes, why didn't you do the dishes? More like accusatory, right?
Yeah.
So always just, instead of getting defensive, ask. Okay,
Yeah.
well, did you mean that in a very defensive way, or are you just being curious?
Yeah.
Take away that perception, right?
Exactly. The second principle of communication is that it is impossible to not communicate. So there is verbal and nonverbal ways to communicate. Even a silent treatment is still communicating, even though you're not verbally communicating. So that's important to remember. And then the third principle is that every message has both content and feeling, like what you were mentioning, that there's the actual words, the content, and then there's also the feeling that might be connected to the content. So it's expressed through nonverbal cues, body language, tone of voice, gestures, facial expression, inflection, and volume. So all of these things, so that's kind of what kind of can contribute to that person's perception is that the communication has content, but it also has that nonverbal aspect to it, which is the feeling.
Which
So
can
when the
be just as
content,
important.
yes, and when the content and feeling don't match up, then there can be confusion for the listener. So an example that this author provides is that if a person says, "I'm not mad at you," but if they say it in a very loud, angry voice, which is the feeling part, that can be confusing. Like, oh, yeah, you are mad at me. You're just saying you're not mad at me.
Yeah.
Which is something I'm
There's a
very
lot of
guilty of. Like,
TikToks.
I'm not mad at you, but I am mad.
So funny, so confusing. There's a lot of fun
Yes,
TikToks on this that I've seen.
absolutely. And then this one's very obvious, and I feel very strongly about this too, is electronic communication, right? Email, text, instant messaging, that can be easily misinterpreted, understood, and it could be challenging to communicate your feelings. That perception can come into play if there's not like an emoji or a feeling next to the content. And if there's no nonverbal cues and the words are just isolated. And then research also, so the fourth principle is that research shows that nonverbal cues are more believable than verbal cues. So our human brain tends to give more importance to nonverbal cues than verbal cues. And it goes back to that saying, right? Actions speak louder than words. So whenever there's a discrepancy between the content, which is the verbal, and then the feeling, which is a nonverbal message, the person on the receiving end will almost always give more weight to the feeling.
Makes sense.
Yeah. So those are the four primary aspects of communication. So why is communication important? Why does it matter? This is another Psychology Today article about, and it's titled Why Communication Matters. And the author kind of speaks or writes about how we communicate helps relationships get off on the right foot. It helps them navigate problems and overcome change over time. So when we communicate, we develop, create, maintain, and alter our relationships. We communicate to work our way through family changes and challenges in verbal and nonverbal ways. So communication, right? Again, it's impossible not to communicate, and communication can really, positive communication and open communication, which I'll get into, can foster relationships, support and problem resolution, support in the development and maintenance and change in relationships. I wanted to get, just because we're a mental health podcast, I wanted to relate communication to relationships in a way, just to kind of hit on that. I know you mentioned that, how you talk to your clients about it too. So this is a Forbes article titled How to Communicate in a Relationship According to Experts. It's very recent. It was published in January 2024, and the author is Nicole McDermott. So the benefits of good communication in a relationship, research shows for that, is that it can help people problem solve, and that open communication is the spine that holds up a relationship, whether it is thriving or under strain. And this is, I know we got into open communication a little early, but again, research and experts are sharing that open communication is a spine that holds up a relationship. So that's important to remember. So how do we differentiate between good versus poor communication? So good communication clarifies problems and creates closeness between partners or people. Poor communication intensifies problems and creates distance between partners. This was a direct quote from a licensed marriage and family therapist in this article. So some examples of good communication is that a person when they're showing good communication, they're paying attention and listening while their partner speaks. They listen to understand and to respond. Which is something I have to catch myself to, like, oh, I need to just listen instead of like interrupting them and being like, no, you're wrong. The next example for good communication is that a person who's a good communicator, they'll validate their partner's thoughts and feelings, often by acknowledging and repeating back some of what was said. They ask questions, they understand even when their partner has different perspectives and opinions, and they don't raise their voice.
That's important.
Examples of poor communication is that this person interrupts, they act in passive-aggressive ways, they hold grudges, they tiptoe around their partner, they guess or assume their partner's feelings, they sweep problems under the rug rather than hash them out, so like conflict avoidance. They argue repeatedly over the same subject, they call their partner names, they make threats, and they raise their voice. Any thoughts on the examples?
No, those are really well done. Yeah, no thoughts. Lots of thoughts run around, but nothing.
Yeah.
relevant at the moment.
So in this Forbes article, the author also goes into communication styles. So there's 4 types that this article talks about for communication styles. So the first one is assertive. So someone with an assertive communication style, they speak in a direct manner while communicating compassion and a desire to compromise in ways to meet your needs. The second style is passive. They tend to defer to others when it's time to make a decision. It's indecisiveness, and they're conflict avoidant. And the third is aggressive. This style involves standing up for one's own rights at the risk of possibly disregarding another person's feelings. A person who resorts to this approach may likely have a low tolerance for emotional discomfort and tends to get upset more frequently than others. And then the fourth one is nonverbal communication style, which allows people to communicate information about their needs, attitudes, emotions, and intentions without using words. It can be healing and informative to couples when used in a non-passive aggressive way. So good nonverbal communication looks like relaxed posture, mirroring body language, and eye contact while talking to your partner. Again, like everything that we've talked about when it comes to categories and styles, this is not a set cut and dry. People may have mixed communication styles in a relationship. So it's spectrum, right? It doesn't mean you're like one or the other. It could be a mix as well. So this author also talks about like, once you become aware of your communication style and you learn like you want to improve your communication style or your communication, some suggestions that this author provided was, looking at books about communication, some resources, reading articles that talk about improving communication. And then also, like with your partner, discussing communication preferences. So checking in with each other, asking each other questions like, how do you feel when we communicate during stressful moments? Do you feel appreciated and acknowledged? While we're arguing, what do you most need from me? And then, of course, working with a professional. So I really liked this Forbes article because it was very comprehensive when it comes to, yeah, I loved it. Go Nicole McDermott.
I didn't even know Forbes did like articles like this.
Yeah, I know. Me neither. When this showed up in my research, I was like, this is a very nice article that I wanted to include in the research for today.
I'm glad you did.
Thank you. So now we're going to dive into. So now we got into we reviewed communication. Now we're going to talk about what open communication means. So according to a Psychology Fanatic article, the definition of open communication is that it's a transparent and unrestricted exchange of information, ideas, and feelings between individuals or within a group. It involves sharing thoughts, concerns, and feedback honestly and respectfully, fostering trust and understanding. People who practice open communication, they're okay with openly asking for what they need and what they want. So now that we've gone some definitions, when I was actually just doing my like basic research, a Times of India article popped up. And so this is like part of my like background definition, but also relates to the South Asian culture in a way, like kind of crosses over between the both of those aspects. So this was published in April 2023. The article is titled Why Open Communication is Important in Any Relationship. So the author, these are some quotes from the article that I extracted. The author says, it is a two-way process of exchanging information, ideas, and feelings between individuals and plays a crucial role in building trust and mutual respect. It fosters a sense of honesty and transparency. And when both parties feel comfortable sharing their thoughts and emotions without fear of judgment or repercussion, it creates a safe and supportive environment for growth and development. Open communication promotes active listening and empathy, and it's essential for addressing and resolving issues that may arise in any relationship. By discussing problems openly and honestly, individuals can identify the root cause of the problem and work together to find a solution.
It requires a certain sense of vulnerability.
When I was doing this research, it almost felt like open communication, it should be like a tool in like the toolbox, right? Like this is a tool to help you work through problems, overcome challenges in a relationship. But again, as we get into a little bit more of like the South Asian connection, it can pose as a challenge. Like open communication can be challenging for some people. So now going into the South Asian culture, I actually wanted to zoom out a little bit. I found an article I thought was really helpful and important to include. It's called The Role of Silence in Asian American Families. So again, it's not South Asian specifically, but it kind of falls under it just because silence is something that we have read about. I feel like I read about that. That's a practice, nonverbal communication that can happen within South Asian families. So the author of this article is Stephanie Scher, and it was published in May 2022. And so I have this article is very well written, so I wanted to kind of include some more points from this article as well. So the Eastern culture places importance on collectivism, valuing the needs of the group and community over the individual, generosity over selfishness, and harmony over conflict. So in order to preserve relationships, Asian cultures often default to suppression in order to maintain social harmony, right? The needs of the group takes over the individual's needs. And communication is often more indirect to avoid potential conflict or embarrassment. Greater sensitivity towards the needs of others, paying greater attention to others rather than themselves during communication is common. Asian values emphasize anticipating the needs of others, so there isn't a need to verbally express what is wanted or needed. I feel like that's so common, right? Like in the household where your parents might, like my parents at least, anticipated what I needed and they just did the job for me instead of communicating like, hey, do you need help with this? Verbally expressing. This type of anticipatory action comes from highly trained inference skills, a strong sense of tradition, and keen observational ability, which is probably why we're so good at our jobs, because this is like, these skills are helpful, right? This is one way Asian families showcase love, through service-based action. Some examples include cooking and serving meals, fulfilling family obligations, sacrificing one's wants for another, or going out of one's way to make a family member's life easier. So, reiterating all of that, the communication style in the Asian culture, Asian American culture, is action. It's nonverbal versus verbal, right? Family members will anticipate what must be done and accomplish the task independently without checking if other people are helping out, or like, should I do the same amount of work as others, right? Rather than asking if one needs help or discussing what the next steps are.
Yeah. That also reminds me a lot of Korean dramas. Obviously, I'm very obsessed with Korean dramas. And this is something that's a common theme, right? Is being able to infer or just tell how somebody's feeling, what they're needing, and just being able to provide for it. And I think it's like kind of whimsical and romantic to see on screen. But that can sometimes be a little bit dangerous, because in real life, that's what you expect people to do, read your mind.
Yes.
Most of us don't have that ability.
And that assumption is so flawed, right? Once we learn about the sender and the receiver difference, right? The perception that there's this whole filter that involves the other person's thoughts and feelings. So like, you can't assume that person understands your nonverbal cues when it's not clearly and directly verbally expressed.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why it's such an important conversation to bring to light. Like, it is kind of cool that maybe there are a few people out there that can do that are good at doing that. It's a strength, and that's awesome. But it's also a lot of work.
Exactly.
We don't need that. We can be, more communicative, more assertive, more open with what we need. Not to say that that's a bad thing, right? If people are doing that and people who both do that find each other and they can both do that for one another, cool, super awesome. That's totally fine. This is like a spectrum, right? It can be really cool. It can be really awesome. But sometimes it can set up an unrealistic, unhelpful image in our minds of what couples and what relationships should look like.
Exactly. So going into silent treatment, same article, right? Asian American families. Silent treatment is a response to a disagreement or argument and can be used to avoid conflict, punish, or control. The silent treatment is a type of covert behavior, a strategic enactment of aloofness, avoidance, and dismissive behavior that serves to discomfort and frustrate recipients. So we know the holistic psychologist, Dr. Nicole Petra, the holistic psychologist. This article actually quotes the holistic psychologist, right? She says that the silent treatment can be so painful because someone is denying our very existence. This can cause a lot of wounding, especially if we experience this in childhood, when we have to make sense of how someone that lives with us, who our survival depends on, would pretend we are no longer there. when we do something to upset them. So I thought that was really strong, and so I wanted to include that quote from the holistic psychologist. So now we're going to go into just like the different types of verbal and nonverbal, or kind of verbal, nonverbal communication. So this was so interesting. I just wanted to include it as just because of curiosity. There's a cultural atlas for Australia's migrant populations. Did you know that?
What does that mean?
Like they have an atlas where they have different demographics.
Yeah.
And so it's an educational resource for the Australian community to provide comprehensive information on the cultural background of the different
know that.
Australia's migrant populations. The aim is to
That's-
improve social cohesion and promote inclusion.
Okay.
So there was like an Indian culture like section, and there was a
Wow.
communication section for that. So I was like, interesting. They're like teaching the rest of the Australian population about migrant populations, such as people from India.
That's cool.
And in that section, it was really short, but I wanted to include they talked about how verbal communication can tend to be indirect. They avoid conflict or confrontation, and they will remain silent rather than saying no.
Mm.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I've seen that in action. Oh yeah.
Yes. So I have a little segment for us when it comes to nonverbal communications.
Ooh, okay.
So this segment, I couldn't think of a really creative kind of title, but I was just going to say, what does this mean? So I'm going to kind of describe it or reenact it. I'll do both. I'll try to reenact this nonverbal gesture, and you need to tell me what it means to you. Okay?
Right.
Okay. So I'm going to describe it first, and then I'll try to reenact it. I hope I don't embarrass myself. So the first one is like I'm like with my eyes closed, I'm making eye contact, and I'm shaking my head.
It's closed.
Oh, sorry, eyes open. Eyes open, and I'm like,
I think that you are actively listening. You're nodding along.
okay. All right.
You're hearing
all right.
me. You're showing me. I hear you.
Okay. Okay. What about like I'm shaking my head no and my eyes are wide?
You're disagreeing. You're like, no, I don't like that.
Yeah. Okay. Disagreeing. Okay. Now I'm nodding my head yes, slowly with an O face.
You are surprised by what you're hearing, but you're like, whoa, that's interesting. That's cool.
Yes.
You're making some kind of agreement.
Okay.
While surprised.
Okay. What about this? I'm sideways. I'm sideways, head nodding like an infinity sign.
You're doing the Indian nod, right? You're like, okay.
What does that mean?
You're saying, okay, sure.
Okay. What about this is a noise, like I'm shaking my head no, and I'm going clicking noise and shaking my head no.
You're saying, shame.
Shame. Yes. See, but you're getting all this from I'm not even saying a word. Saying a word. Okay. What about I have my this is not just South Asian, but like I'm like looking at you, right, while you're talking, and then I kind of like turn my head to the side and roll my eyes.
You're like, is she gonna be done yet?
Yeah.
You're just over it.
Exactly. What about I'm like nodding my head yes really fast.
You're just like so passionate about what I am saying right now. You're emphatically saying yes. Hell yeah.
Okay. I will take I whenever people do that to me, and this could be my perception, it's like, oh, like I get it. Like
Like
you
move
can stop
on
now. Like you can stop now. Like you're just moving your head really fast. Like, okay, I get it. Yeah.
I can see that.
Yeah.
I think that also brings in your body language too, right? If your body language is kind of like, hey, and you're kind of like turning away from the person, I would see it like that. But I feel like if you're relaxed, sitting on a couch, you know, making some noises, making your eyes big, I would feel like you're passionately agreeing.
Yeah. And then going back to like the head nods, like I feel like that's just a cultural difference, right? Thank you for being part of my segment. I appreciate it.
So
for what does this mean?
I get 100 out of 100.
Yes. Well, it's perception. So it's whatever it means to you, right? But going back to the infinity sign, sideways 8, head nod, right? Like this. There's a BBC article that literally is titled Cracking India's Mystifying Nod Code. What I read that title, I cracked up. I was like, what? Mystifying nod code. But don't let the title fool you because there was actually very insightful information in this article. So, a Mumbai-based writer was quoted in this article by the author. The Mumbai-based writer's name is Priya Patian. I don't know if I'm saying that right. And actually, the infinity sign numerical 8 lying down is quoted by her. That's why I wanted to give credit, like the numerical 8 lying down, like sideways. But it's literally that, like you shake your head and like that sideways 8, an infinity sign. So, So the author talks about just the head nods and just the meaning behind it. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that. So the author says, in my own experience, the faster the shake, the more enthusiastic the agreement, especially when used with raised eyebrows for added emphasis. But on the other hand, that side, like that infinity sign nod, can also be used to convey, okay, whatever you say, like whatever you say. An indifferent shoulder shrug without actually shrugging the shoulders. So a writer from Chennai and a corporate behavior consultant named Pradeep Chakravarti says that this gesture is the Indian way of both dealing with gray areas and leaving the door open in all major and minor relationships. Who knew that sideways nod? Yeah, right? Like you're just like, okay, right? Saying no is not possible because it can mean to cut ties in that relationship. And what if we need their help one day? So a person was quoted that I know I can't do it, but I can't say no either. So rather than outright refusal, I buy time by being deliberately vague. Through this nod.
I've never really heard it be put like that, but that is insightful.
Really? Right? I agree as well. I was like, at first I was like, what is this article? What is this title? But then it was very helpful information. It was interesting. But yeah, that's kind of a little bit of my background with a little bit of a segment into it. Any thoughts? Any things to feel like you want to add?
That was awesome. The only thing I would add, the only thing that kept coming up for me as we were talking about communication was, I think, a fun little tip, perhaps. But with clients, I talk about all the time how nonverbal cues are so often missed. Like when we're talking about conflict resolution in therapy, we focus so much on the verbal, of what was said, the what was felt, the what is not being communicated, but we don't focus on how it's being communicated. And so I do this thing with my clients called the fair fighting rules. It's not something I came up with, but we add together in a collaboration with clients and we talk about, for you guys as a couple, what do you guys want to put on here as fair fighting rules? So these are the things that you say like, oh, no, we're getting into this. We need to take a step back and pause. So things can be like when we're starting to raise our voices. It could be things like, like name calling. We don't want to get into that. But I also say like, okay, well, don't forget the nonverbal things. Sometimes when you get into arguments, we like kind of like, side eyeing them, rolling our eyes, turning away, maybe sighing,
crossing our arms.
Yeah, and all of those things can make another person feel like you don't really care, that you're getting defensive. And so those are important things to think about too. So I know we're not talking about conflict resolution, but that was just something that kept coming up of like, our nonverbals are so important when we're talking about effectively communicating with somebody in a way to build a relationship.
And I'm sure we've like hit a little bit on communication on nonverbal cues in our last season's episode, the resolving relationship conflict. But I think you're right. Like pointing that out is real important. And just like research shows that nonverbal cues are often given more importance than verbal cues. Like you can have a great sit down conversation with your partner and like resolve, but if your nonverbal cues don't match your verbal cues, that can create confusion for your partner and maybe affect their feelings a little bit more.
That was interesting. I would have just made an assumption here of they're like both important equally, but it's really cool that the research kind of indicates like nonverbal is sometimes more important.
Exactly.
That's really cool.
Yeah. It's like, again, the actions. People give more importance to what your actions look like versus your words. Okay, you ready for my little reflection and story?
Yes.
Okay. So when it comes to open communication, I feel that it hasn't really been common within the culture I grew up in. I feel that miscommunications and misunderstandings are often rooted in the lack of open communication. I think that stems from the fear from upsetting others or hurting others' feelings after openly communicating. So understanding that if you communicate openly, you're going to hurt other people's feelings and you want to avoid that. So you don't openly communicate. That's kind of, I feel, that I observed growing up. And of course, this comes from the people pleasing culture, the collectivist culture that we are in. I've noticed that ambiguous, vague communication is a protective factor to say no when one wanted to say no. But instead of saying no directly, they give that vague communication, that ambiguous communication. I feel like maybe before I became more aware of this, that I was guilty of it too. I will, like in the past, until recently, I would find myself being vague, especially if I felt like I needed, say, for example, I needed to take a break and I wanted some me time versus getting dinner with a friend. And instead of clearly saying no because it was hard for me because I didn't want to upset my friend, I was vague and I'll be like, oh, like we'll plan when we get closer to it or something like that, I feel like I've said that before. I might have said that to you too. That's so funny.
That's your like go-to way of like your own head nod.
Yeah, this is my own like infinity sign. It's
Verbal infinity
right.
nod.
Yeah, it is a verbal vague. Sometimes at work too, I have to be vague too, just to like set boundaries, which is another thing. Like, oh, like I'll try to find this toy or I'll try to give you this, but I can't make promises.
And to be fair, there's nothing wrong with that. That
Yeah.
is totally
Yeah.
fine. If that's what you need to be able to have
Yeah.
your boundaries, totally fine.
Right. So my parents did not model open communication, I would say. I would often witness their lack of open communication resulting in misunderstandings and disagreements. My parents didn't really model open communication with extended family members. If there was a conflict, they would keep that in their assumptions about the other person to themselves. Like if there was a conflict within the extended family. I feel that I developed open communication early on as a survival technique more. I found at a young age that open communication, even though it was hard, it will protect me. Just because thought it would make me feel true to myself. But that was very different from people close to me who felt that open communication would lead to conflict and disappointment. So their survival technique, when I compare it to them, was to avoid open communication. And that's what they became used to. And I think my mom and my sister especially and my mom like developed that avoidance. Like if we don't communicate openly, we don't have to deal with the disappointment. We don't have to deal with conflict. So when it comes to open communication, I feel that my husband and I have very different levels and understanding of open communication. Our perceptions about it is very different too. And compared to him, I feel that it comes easier for me just because I had learned about it at an early age. And I want to say I didn't develop these open communication skills from home. I feel that I developed it at school. Like my open communication, which is so like insightful when I'm reflecting about it, that whenever I openly communicated with my teachers, with my peers, it resulted in better grades. It resulted in better understanding the assignments I have to complete, the projects I'm doing with peers. And so it was rewarded and positive reinforced in that area, whether that's like completing an assignment or doing a project or starting an initiative. Like whenever I openly communicated, it helped me be successful. So I think that's when I started developing that pattern or learning the importance of open communication.
That's amazing. That's really cool. Did you see somebody in school kind of model some of that open communication?
Yeah, I think a lot of the teachers that you remember a lot that were honest. They were vulnerable in front of their students. They were honest. They followed up with their word with their students. I think that really modeled as well. Like they were openly communicating with their students, building that trust. And I think that's probably where I picked up on it, just because that part of my life, I think, made me feel the made me feel the best about myself. Just because at home, and I know I've talked about this in the past, with open communication or not, any mistake or disappointment I had made, it resulted in silent treatment or resulted in, them being upset with me. And that's again their perception of what mistake I made, like how the magnitude of it, right? But like the holistic psychologist mentions, right, even that as a young child, when you're given silent treatment, it can really affect even in your relationships later on. So when it comes to the silent treatment, that nonverbal communication, I was given that a lot at a young age, and I got that even when I was older, like whether it was like disappointing my family with changing my career or like just my own decisions that didn't agree with my parents' decisions.
Mm.
I would say when the silent treatment would show up in my friends or my romantic relationship, it would really trigger me.
For
So
sure.
my husband's kind of coping is to kind of process it through himself, like the conflict, which
Mm.
means he is giving me silence, but not in that intentional, ignorant conflict avoidance way. Like he just needs that time to himself to
Mm.
process. Versus me, I'm like, no, we need to talk about this now.
Yeah.
And so when that silent treatment, it wasn't really silent treatment from his side, but I took it that way. So when I was seeing the silent treatment, like it would really trigger me and I would get really upset and I would kind of keep pushing him like, hey, like we need to talk about this. And then after a couple of times of realizing this was happening, we were able to openly communicate and share like why I was getting upset, why he needed some time. And after discussing that and having open communication, right, honestly sharing our thoughts and feelings with each other, I learned that, or he learned that he just needs to tell me, like, hey, I need some time to process. And then I need to take that. Like, he needs to be direct and verbal. And then I need to take that verbal, like, not take the nonverbal cues
Mm.
and misunderstand them to the point where I'm like triggered. So that's kind of like the silent treatment aspect. But I will say that even within our South Asian community and the community I grew up in, the nonverbal communication is so loud. It's so loud,
Mhm.
right? Like, I think that nonverbal communication is paid attention more than verbal communication,
Mhm.
right? There's silent treatment. There are facial expressions and gestures such as wide eyes, shaking your head no in disapproval or disappointment, crossed arms, turned body while the aunties gossip. I feel that I can keep going on and on about this, right? It's just so loud, the nonverbal communication. Sometimes I feel that people, like you mentioned, that people don't even realize like how loud their body language is. Um, and you mentioned like when you talk to your clients about it, like it's important not to miss that. It's important to pay attention to that too, just because it's just as important, if not more, when it comes to communication. So that's kind of
Apparently
my
more.
take. Yeah, right. That's kind of my take on communication and our community and my background.
You did so good.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing. Definitely. I agree with you. You know, the silence is a big part of the culture. And I think, I don't know about you, but for me, especially early on, I discovered in therapy, my first experience with it, that I was really uncomfortable in silence.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm hearing you say, like, bring up these insightful moments of like how silence is used in our community. I wonder if that's why there's so much discomfort in the
Mm-hmm.
silence. It's because
Mm-hmm.
it does still speak. Silence speaks volumes.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in a vulnerable place like therapy, when you're sharing with your therapist vulnerable pieces of yourself and you're met with some silence, maybe because they're allowing you to feel fully and share fully, or like whatever the reason might be, it's a little bit scary. I think that's
Yes.
like now I'm recognizing, I think that's what I was feeling often. I had like this urge to keep word vomiting and filling that silence.
Yeah,
Now is on the other side of the chair. I can recognize that silence is really, really important
it
as
is.
long as you're holding this, your body language is holding space for like warmth and
Mm-hmm.
openness and like love
Mm-hmm.
and acceptance versus like, I don't know, maybe defensive
Punishment.
or
Yeah.
yeah, like kind of like
And I
punishment.
would say like silent treatment or silence has such a negative connotation in general in our culture. Like whenever there's
Yeah.
silence, it
Yeah.
causes discomfort even to you and for me especially is because I associate it with disapproval and
Mm-hmm.
disappointment and punishment. So
Yeah.
when that
Disappointment
comfortable
for sure.
silence comes up, it's
Yeah.
confusing if it's not
It is so
verbally
confusing.
communicated why the silence is there,
Yeah.
right? My
Mm.
brain automatically goes to like I did something wrong, that's why he's
They're
silent.
upset.
They're
Yeah.
upset.
Yeah.
And that's why that verbal communication is important to clarify that assumption, that perception.
Open communication.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That's a good point. This was a fun episode.
Yeah.
This is what I'm saying. We can talk so much about
Yeah.
communication. I love this
Yeah.
concept.
It is such a good topic.
Hmm. Are you ready for my story?
Yes, I'm ready.
When I was thinking about what I wanted to share today, I was thinking about reflecting a lot on like my communication. My communication has metamorphosized so much. It's just constantly changing.
Mm-hmm.
My first recollection of how my communication used to be obviously very driven by people pleasing, obviously. And what I mean by that is I was really almost like never sharing how I truly felt or what I truly thought. I would never say like, I want this or I don't want that or that hurt my feelings or anything that wasn't positive. I didn't really make space for. And even if like somebody would be directly like disrespectful or I would feel really, really hurt by something, I would definitely go off and cry, but I would never address it.
Yeah.
I was a big crybaby back then. Such a big crybaby. It's okay.
Crying is okay. Crying is okay.
I feel I gotta let it out.
Yeah.
But I would much rather and much sooner just cry out my frustrations and my sadness than I would ever to bring it up with anybody. Now, as we've talked about lots and lots on this podcast, for me, all that really resulted in was lots and lots of resentment and disappointment in myself and other people and just being upset, basically because I was thinking, well, I'm going out of my way to think about the people. Why aren't they doing that for me? Why aren't they making space for me? When they're just taking up space.
Yeah.
I could take up space too. I wasn't choosing to.
Yeah.
Right. And so I felt like that was kind of my original MO, was very like hiding who I was, my feelings, my thoughts, very people pleasy, very closed off communication. What that evolved into with all that ball of anger and resentment was very passive aggressive communication and behaviors and like pettiness almost. And I didn't love it even at that time. As I was doing it, I would be further upset and further angry because I was acting out as a way to try to protect myself, but then I was upset that I was hurting other people in the process.
Yeah.
What a confusing time.
Yeah, it is confusing.
Yeah, it really was. Were you saying something?
Oh no. I was just thinking, like, are you thinking my thoughts? I was just thinking, are you listening? Are you listening to my thoughts? I was just thinking that that's such a I can relate that with that too. Just that in the moment you're not agreeing with what's happening and what you're doing, but the previous experience, your trauma is making you do what you're doing.
Yeah. Exactly. And a lot of that was fueled too, because even as I was trying to break out of the people pleasing and finally prioritize myself, but I was so confused on how to do it properly.
Yeah.
It was also paired up with this like fear, the fear of this unknown. I've never tried this before. What does that look like? How are they going to react? What's going to happen?
Yeah.
Right. And then the fear of also hurting their feelings or disappointing them. That was a big one. Always, as a people pleaser, right? You don't want to disappoint others.
Yeah.
But by definition, then that means that I somehow had the godlike ability to be responsible for someone's emotions, that I would be able to change how they feel. That's not how it works. Their thoughts inform how they feel. Not me. It's their perception. And once, I was able to like actually work through that in therapy and really check myself and check those beliefs, that's when I finally learned how to like actually hold space to prioritize myself, to speak my truth lovingly, respectfully, assertively, and still care for others while I cared for myself.
Right.
I was more willing to compromise without sacrificing important things. I could finally learn how to sit in the discomfort of silence and learn how to just kind of be like, okay, I don't know if they're upset. That's my perception. I can ask. Are you upset by that? Did that disappoint you? Just go ahead and take that open communication tool and find out if your perception is right or wrong. Yeah. So as a result of all of that mess of a journey into getting to where we are now, being an assertive communicator, an open communicator, I think that it's been a very confusing journey, but I'm glad that I went through it because one, it gives me the ability to be empathetic to clients struggling, to family members, friends who struggle with that, continuing to feed into this part of my identity that I really did care about growing up, which was, oh, like she's so sweet and like, oh, she's so thoughtful. I really love those things. At a time when I was first starting out, those are kind of a double-edged sword because it made me feel like I wasn't those things if I didn't care and put them first. Now I can recognize I can put myself first and take care of them and take care of me and take care of them and take care of me. So with the boundaries that I've learned how to create now and the assertive communication I've learned to use now, I've never been happier. There are times it's still tough. Okay, we're a work in progress. Ain't nothing perfect. There's still times where maybe like something specific might happen and I might still struggle in that
Mm-hmm.
moment.
Mm-hmm.
But more often than not, it's not a challenge every single day
Yeah,
to try to
so
carve out
good
space.
progress. So proud of you. And I definitely can vouch that I've seen that effort that you're putting in and that progress you're making. It's so admirable. It's so inspirational.
Got to preach
Hmm.
or got to do what I preach.
Yeah, you gotta practice it.
Yeah. And progress over perfection always, because there's no such
Always.
thing anyway. It's
Yes.
okay. It
Right.
doesn't have to be perfect. I don't need to always feel like it's easy. I have the
Hmm.
tools and I can use them.
Yeah, you can.
So that's my story as I was
Yeah.
reflecting on it. And I mean, I was really more focused on myself, but I would say that if I was really focused on the communication that I really witnessed around me, it's very similar to your story. It's
Hmm.
a very
Yeah.
universal thing. We don't often see a lot of open communication. We do see a lot of perceptions running the show, not really,
Assumptions.
openly communicating and checking those perceptions, which then leads to miscommunicated emotions, hurt feelings, and
Hmm. And then not openly communicating about those hurt feelings. It just keeps going. It's a cycle.
spirals. Yeah,
Spirals. Yeah. It's
exactly.
very admirable though to like hear about your personal journey of communication. It is such a basic concept, but again, it relates to so much. How we communicate reflects how we think about ourselves, how we think about others, how we perceive, like how do we set boundaries, right? Communication, how do we communicate our boundaries, all of that. How do we resolve
Mhm.
conflicts? All of that relates to communication.
Yeah.
So it's,
That's why that quote you said earlier, open communication is like the spine. It's
yeah.
literally the thing that holds up the whole structure.
Yeah, it is the spine, and it's so important to, like you mentioned, how you worked in building open communication, positive communication in your journey. It's so important to
Yeah.
cultivate that and build it
Yeah.
for
That's
a
hard work.
positive experience. It is.
Yeah.
And I really appreciated how you explained and laid out the distinction between what you were feeling at first and like how you acted the way you were acting because of those feelings, and then how did you come out of that,
Yeah.
and just coming out of that people pleasing mentality and
Mhm.
understanding that it's okay to have open communication and not be afraid of the other person's reactions.
Yeah.
Like for me, that was also a distinction. Like as soon as I learned and accepted that other people's reactions are not my responsibility, I
Mm.
snapped out of the people pleasing mindset. Their reaction is not my responsibility. It's their
Yeah.
perception, like you said.
Yeah.
So I can say what I need to say. And then if they react a certain way, that's on them, not me, because that's is their
Yeah.
reaction.
Yeah.
I,
And they're allowed to feel whatever they're feeling. If they're
yeah,
upset,
it's
that's
valid.
okay.
It's
That's
valid.
fine.
Yeah.
Yeah. Doesn't mean that you're suddenly not going to have a relationship. They're just
Hmm.
upset. They need to feel out
Yeah.
their upsetness.
Yeah. And open communication really relates to that, right? Like truly communicating how you truly feel, your true
Mhm.
authentic self. And before I came out of that mindset, like I was also afraid, just like you. My story is similar in a way too, where I would hide or be passive. I wouldn't tell it, like I would kind of be vague, not really say the full truth when I needed to maybe be clearer and set boundaries and
Mhm.
communicate openly. And I feel like when that happens, even though in the moment there's that positive reward in the moment, like, oh, like I didn't have to say no, so they're fine. Like that was
Yeah.
the immediate reward. But the long term is maybe because you said no, you're not being like as open with them, you're regretting spending time with them, whatever you were saying no to, right? Whether that was like spending time with a friend when you really needed that personal time. In the
Mm.
example I gave earlier, I might not be fully my authentic self when I'm hanging out with that friend. I might be like eager to be done hanging out with a friend. It wouldn't
Yeah.
feel, I wouldn't feel excited about it,
Yeah.
right? Again, that can affect the long term, right? Like when you're overextending yourself and pushing your priorities and needs to the side for the others, it can show up through resentment, like you said, and it can bleed through your interactions without realizing.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Because of nonverbal cues, right? What
Hmm.
if we slip up in some ways and we're nonverbally showcasing, like, I
I
don't want
gotta
to be
go.
here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or like, anxiously bouncing your legs and like turning your body, like all of that, like ready to
Yeah.
get out of there.
And it's not even about that person, it's about where you are. But what that
Hmm.
person is perceiving is, oh, are they done? talking to me?
Truly.
Are they not enjoying themselves? Do they not like me anymore?
Right.
You know,
Right.
spiraling, where we can just call it out, just say it.
Yeah. Speak your truth.
Speak your truth. I love that.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, I have this phrase that I use with clients to like make it seem dramatic, but I say radical honesty. And so what I
Right.
mean when I talk to clients about radical honesty is if you're afraid of how somebody's going to take what you're about to say, then include that as a part of what you're going to say in your open communication.
Yeah. Be
Say,
vulnerable.
yeah, just say like, hey, I have something to say and I'm a little bit concerned about how you're going to take it. Let's talk about it. I don't intend it in XYZ ways. I literally just mean it like this. Okay, here goes. Say your piece
Mm-hmm.
and then just check in. Okay, so again, I meant it like this. This is not my intention. I love hanging out with you, but I'm really going to need to cancel this meeting because I really am just so tired and I
Mm-hmm.
really am excited to hang out with you. I'm too tired to really be myself right now.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I love that
You know,
example.
because if the fear is, oh my God, they're going to think I keep canceling on them and I'm flaking and I don't like them, then just call it out. Tell them that. Say, I'm really afraid you're going to think I'm flaking on you, but I'm just so tired from my
Mm-hmm.
day.
Yeah.
I'd love to do this another time. You know, call it
Yeah.
out. Radical honesty.
Right. Right. And of course, like this is much of like an easier example, and there are much harder and tougher, more challenging conversations that are even more difficult to be radically honest and more. But I think the people pleasing mindset can really hinder that open communication. So it's all
Absolutely.
connected.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I really like radical honesty though, because most of the people pleasing is also that fear of how are they going to take this.
Mm-hmm.
But with the radical honesty, you're getting ahead of their possible incorrect perceptions and saying, please don't take it in this
Yeah.
way.
Yeah.
This is what I mean.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. Wow.
Well, it's a fun topic. Yay.
Yes. Yay. Communication, open communication.
Communication. Want me to wrap up?
Yeah.
Let's do it. So we're wrapping up today's episode. You know, I still do this thing where in
Say
sessions
podcast.
I call them episodes, and I keep thinking I'm going to say a session in one of these
I love
episodes.
it. I love it.
So wrap up our episode, our pod
Mm-hmm.
episode.
Mm-hmm.
If today's topic resonated with you and you'd like to share your story with us or ask questions, you can reach us at talksouthasiantome@gmail.com, or you can find us on any and all the socials at the handle at talksouthasiantome. Catch you guys next time.